My name is Anton Stubner, and I'm the director at Catharine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. I'm so just totally happy to see everybody here today, and I'm so happy that you can join us for our special event, In Conversation, Stephanie Syjuco and Glenn Adamson, in conjunction with Native Resolution. Native Resolution, of course, is the title of Stephanie's extraordinary solo exhibition, which is on view at the gallery through April 10th. So I, first of all, want to thank both Stephanie and Glenn for their time today. And knowing their respective work and scholarship, I'm sure this will be a dynamic and very insightful talk. So before we begin, this is fun, admitting people at the same time. Before we begin, I would just like to note that we are recording today's conversation, which will be hosted on the gallery's website in the coming week. So with that in mind, I have a few brief housekeeping notes. As we are recording, we do ask that participants remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. This will better enable us to maintain a consistent flow and pace during the talk. So Stephanie will guide us through the works on view in her solo exhibition, Native Resolution, and Glenn will be joining her throughout in conversation. Following Stephanie's presentation, Glenn and Stephanie will have a brief talk, and then we will open the discussion to audience Q&A. So for this portion, we do ask that you please drop your questions into the chat so that Stephanie and Glenn can answer these directly. So before Stephanie begins, I'd love to make some brief introductions. So our panelists today are Glenn Adamson and Stephanie Syjuco. Glenn Adamson is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York. He's previously served as the director of the Museum of Arts and Design, the head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Adamson's publications are myriad, but include Thinking Through Craft, The Craft Reader, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, which was co-edited with Jane Pavitt, The Invention of Craft, Art and the Making, and Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects. His newest book is Craft in American History, published by Bloomsbury, and he's the co-host of the online interview series, Design in Dialogue. And Stephanie Syjuco, of course, works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Using critical wit, one of my favorite terms of all time, and collaborative co-creation, her projects have leveraged open source systems, sharer logic, and flows of capital in order to investigate issues of economies and empire. Her recent projects focus on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Syjuco's work is represented in multiple institutions, including the collections of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Milwaukee Art Museum in Wisconsin, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, the Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco, and the San Jose Museum of Art, amongst many others. A longtime educator, she is an associate professor in sculpture at the University of California, Berkeley. She lives in Oakland and has been represented by Catharine Clark Gallery since 2008. So lucky year number 13. So without further ado, Stephanie, let's turn it over to you.
Fabulous. Okay, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And I'm also going to say a big thank you to both the gallery for hosting the exhibition and this talk, as well as Glenn Adamson, because Glenn and I have now known each other, I think, for quite a while. I would say that we're craft adjacent, or sometimes in and out of craft. And so as I've found myself moving through different themes and spaces, we've actually intersected quite a bit. So Glenn, thank you so much for being a part of this as well. And everyone, and everyone, thank you for taking the time to be here today too, because I know that there's a lot going on, and the amount of Zoom conversations are off the charts. It's almost too much and too good. So anyway, I'm just going to jump right into it. And thanks again, Anton, for setting the scene. So the exhibition is up right now, and it's up until April 10. And today, we're going to start off with me just really going quickly through some earlier works that sort of set the stage for my investigations into museums, archives, and a kind of like reworking or rethinking of the archive. And so literally 10 years ago, one of the first exhibitions I had at Catharine Clark Gallery was a literal raiding of the Asian Art Museum's database of ceramic objects. And so this was done without the permission of the museum. And it was a really interesting way to kind of work with digital images that I was downloading from their online collection and then representing them as a kind of like reconstituted collection of my own. That also extended into 3D scans of reflective objects in the collection of the De Young Museum. And so I was doing this with a cell phone and purposefully creating these very bad three-dimensional scans of reflective antiquities to kind of comment on the sort of stuttered or broken knowledge or relationship we might have with certain objects, especially when it comes to thinking about empires and colonies. This is an amazing mirror that's been kind of blown out due to its reflective inability to be scanned properly. And then onto sort of like very large physical installations in which I'm also taking from different sources, printing objects, mixing them in with, I guess, physical objects in order to comment on both photographic history, color calibration charts, and also the ways in which native and other is kind of set upon itself in different ways through both modern art and also the decorative arts. These are just some detail shots to get a sense. So the reason I'm showing this is because, you know, again, I work on accumulation in a lot of ways. And so, you know, just the scope and scale of things lend themselves to, I guess, the visualities of display and collections. And so the bridge piece to kind of start talking about the work, though, that I'm focusing on in Native Resolution is a work that I did about 2 years ago now through the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, where I was responding to a collection of photographs taken during the 1904 World's Fair, in which 1,200 Filipinos were imported into St. Louis in order to kind of perform in a like a cultural display, which was essentially like a human zoo. And so as I was sifting through these images and archives, I was having this very direct relationship with how to both negate the image and also reinsert a kind of dialogue into the narrative. And this is a work that actually Glenn is putting in an exhibition at the Smithsonian. And I'd love to hear some context about that.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, and great to be here with you. And thanks to the gallery for hosting as well. Just to say a little bit about the context in which we'll be displaying this. First of all, the departure point is in fact that Stephanie, you were a research fellow at the Smithsonian as part of the Artist Research Fellow program there. So although this project ultimately was realized in St. Louis, it kind of has DC roots, I guess intellectually we could say. And I'm on the curatorial team for a major project simply called Futures, which will be opening in November at the Arts and Industries building on the mall there in Washington, DC. It's a centerpiece project for the 175th anniversary of the Smithsonian. And you might, I guess, ask, what is a project about the archival past doing in a show about the future? And the answer is that we're looking at previous generations' ways of thinking about futurology and prediction and the worlds of tomorrow. And of course, World's Fairs are a very important part of that. So we're trying to, I suppose, flag for the audience that obviously the past is not neutral, which is a great subject of the current show as well, but also that it's important that we re-intervene in these past events and realize that the traces that they have left to us are essentially prompts to our own ethical and aesthetic response. And so this work is, of course, emblematic of that in all those ways. And Stephanie, maybe I could ask a first question, and I will pepper a few questions throughout the slides as you go through, if that's okay. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that idea of touch and the relationship between the genuine and the ersatz that it implies, because one thing that people will have noticed already, they don't already know this about your work, is that you have a very strong relationship to the idea of fakery and black markets and essentially pretense in all of its forms, and also the value of pretense in a capitalist economy. And to me, this idea of touching implies some degree of direct contact with the real. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that relationship between verification and authenticity on the one hand, and the kind of slipstream of legerdemain that we're always presented with in the visual environment.
Yeah, no, happy to, because I think that actually ties in really well to thinking about images and photography and how images right now kind of circulate, right? So what you're looking at right here, literally through these images, is myself sitting in an archive, sitting in a room of the Missouri Historical Society, going through photographs, literally, in the files, and then by blocking and touching the photographs, creating, I think, a physical linkage between both myself, as an artist, a Filipino-American artist making the work in 2021, with images taken over almost 120 years ago now of, Filipinos who found themselves on a totally different kind of reality. And when I look back at these images, it's interesting to try to think about how to relate to them, right? Like both as a kind of post subject. Like if this is how, Filipinos are viewed at one point, how am I supposed to create my own relationship with this, also knowing the way these images circulate? Because I also think that the interesting thing about ethnographic photography is that despite the fact that it's historical and that we kind of understand these things to be potentially outdated or outmoded forms of representation, they still circulate and they still do work of representation that at times I think we actually are still attempting to resist. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I do think the physicality of this intervention for me was highly important, and that it wasn't done as a simulation, right? So I wasn't downloading these images from the internet. I was making that commitment to touch photographs that I probably shouldn't be touching, for one. But these were also copies of the originals because they wouldn't let me look at the originals anyway. But yes. So I think that connection there definitely dives into the ephemeral nature of images, but also, the kind of physical effects that they sometimes can wreak.
Well, to be fair, you have a long form in the matter of disobeying institutional regulations with regard to the handling of this imagery and collections. I just to underline one thing that I thought was super interesting you just said, which hadn't occurred to me before about this project, because the title is Block Out the Sun. And so the first thing that occurs to you is the simple occlusion or blocking of the image of these disturbing photographs, obviously, and a kind of rectification. But it's also very interesting to think about the gesture as sort of stopping them, like they're traveling in this sort of circulatory regime that images do. And it's almost like you're putting a stop to that motion and freezing it so that we can look at it more closely, which almost pushes against the other idea of a kind of hiding. It's kind of pointing as well.
Yeah,
freezing and pointing.
Absolutely. And also, in the last couple of years, a lot of the titles to my works are actually photographically referenced. So, in order to create an image, or the traditional way of exposing an image is to use light. And the sun was obviously, the way to have done it in before traditional studio lighting techniques. So, yeah, there's, I also just wanted to show a little bit of, the setups. So, when I go photograph into archives, I'm not usually given the kind of royal treatment. Most people don't understand what I'm trying to do. And so despite getting a fellowship, the setups are actually very simple. They're what I can carry with me. It's also kind of a mess. And usually it's only using available light. So there's it's very fascinating to kind of be in and also kind of in the margins of it. But what resulted actually, I think, is pretty exciting. So, as Glenn mentioned, I spent a year from 2019 and 2020 as a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow. And so that's a project that I proposed to the National Museum of American History, in which I would go into their archives and try to search for photographic evidence of the Philippines. And, that sounds like a very simple, kind of excavation, but I was using it as a kind of example of how does an American archive hold and depict a former colony? Like, what does that look like? Because, part of the American history is that the Philippines was actually a colony for about 50 years. And that's a kind of amnesia that usually, happens. Like, it's not a lot of people know that, even though Filipinos are actually the largest Asian American population in the United States, which is also an interesting other fact that most folks don't know. So what does that, what does it look like in the National Archive? And what I found is that the result is here in part in this exhibition, because the archive is a fragmented representation and the narratives were very unclear, or they were heavily weighted in certain directions. So I'm going to just move forward though through some of the exhibition shots so you can get a sense of what the actual show looks like. We painted the walls neutral gray. It's a digital neutral gray. So technically, neutral gray is a photographic element, is meant to, be a kind of the most neutral background possible for whatever you place upon it. And I decided to stay mostly with photographic depictions and representations. So there's 18 image-based works, as well as one video in the video viewing room. And so I scaled it back quite a lot from, say, some of the large installation projects I've done in the past, but I wanted to do that to really focus on some of these collections of images. And so I think for me, the central star are these three, I would call them almost like photo collages, and they're all based on, again, the search for visual evidence of the Philippines. And this particular series, they're called pileups, because I also wanted to simulate what it was like to go through massive amounts of papers and photos and folders. And so what you're looking at, this is pileup, and in parentheses, Eastman. And the main background image actually is of an Eastman camera around the same time period as, when the photographs on top of it were taken. But this background image is actually highly pixelated. And that's literally because the image that I found of it in the Smithsonian archives wasn't a high resolution one. And so I'm also working with this idea of both low res and high resolution in these photographs. And it's kind of hard to see at first, right? So if you don't really look up close, some things are very high resolution. And I wanted to also pick apart some details so you can see that the photographs are actually layered on top of each other. This isn't a digital composite, and there's a lot of things hidden and covering over itself, and a lot of markers of the archive itself remaining. So whether that's labels or, that kind of thing, because it's just as much a part of the visual as the original thing that it meant to, kind of collect.
It's also interesting here, Stephanie, how the archive blocks itself, which anybody who's tried to deal with the massive scale of an archive or a museum collection will be well familiar with, that our attempts to compile information make it impossible for us to get to what we want because there's too much information in the way, which of course now is the universal experience. We call it the internet.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
true to the research process here. I was also wondering if you would talk a little bit about the title of the show, Native Resolution. So you've just mentioned lo-fi, hi-fi. What about native resolution? What does that phrase suggest to you?
Yeah, well, if we go back to this, so, I think it's a double entendre title. Like native resolution, it literally, in digital terms, it refers to sort of like the inherent amount of data in an image. And so that's like the amount of pixels, the image size, that kind of thing. And so you can upsample or downsample from a file's native resolution to get, to enlarge the image or to shrink it. But it's always, the limits of the image are always inherent in there. But also, you think about the word native in thinking about like the foreign versus, the local or the other. Native resolution also, I think for me, calls into question like, is when looking at American history, through what lens is that history being, shown through? And also, how are other peoples being depicted? And in what resolution? And I would like to say, or I would like to guess that it's been a rather low resolution, a very sort of like fragmentary story. So by turning that lens on itself too and showing, say, this high-end camera, this very fancy camera in a low-end capacity, this was its native resolution, which I thought was also kind of ironic. And the thing about these images or these collections, I could go into every single a reason of why each image was selected, because it was quite specific actually. So we've got these composites of everything from, at the top left, this is an image of black buffalo soldiers that were sent to the Philippines in the early 1900s to quell the Filipino rebellion. But there was also a lot of really interesting dialogue that happened with the Black community and thinking about, well, why are we being sent overseas to, put down brown folks who are actually seeking their own independence? And then the image on the right, which I think is hilarious, is a photo I found in the anthropology archives, portrait of man, and in the parentheses you see it written Philippines ? And this actually is Jose Rizal, who is the Philippine national hero, and is like one of the most important, Filipinos in history. And so this interesting overlay on top of the archive, of course, of like, well, how is it being organized and under what? Like, I couldn't ordinarily, this person is unknown in the American archive. It's just portrait of man. So yeah. I think that's really quite telling. And then some other details too. I think I should probably go through these images a bit quicker, but Glenn, stop me if anything kind of like strikes you, just if you want to go into it.
There's so many things. I guess one thing that's occurring to me as you're just going through here, Stephanie, is that there's a shift underway in museums from the only physical control of collections to exerting control by virtue of intellectual property. And the frontier of that control these days, I doubt this will last long, but at the moment, the physical frontier that we experience, or visual frontier, is in fact resolution, because it's only when you're granted permission by the institution that you are able to seize the high resolution version of the image. And this is, something that, we experience all the time, obviously, and the kind of the crapness of a low res JPEG sort of speaks of a kind of deinstitutionalized, unauthorized position. So it's very interesting the way that photographic resolution has become a stand-in for intellectual authority, although as you're pointing out, that intellectual authority is also based on, very shaky foundations, and then simple kind of post-colonial control of these assets. It's all expressed in the pictures.
Yeah. And also what was interesting about, excavating the archive, what I wasn't given access to because they don't have them anymore, or they don't know where it is, or, what we're looking at here, speaking of resolution, on the right-hand side, it's the only image I could find of a particular documentation of American forces in the Philippines having shot a resistant guerrilla. And it's this very low res image that it was actually a glass negative that was then photographed to be put onto microfilm. And then they scanned that little piece of microfilm to get this image, and then they lost the negative.
Oh.
So this is like the stand-in, or the surrogate of what we have for it, with the label, the pixelation, and the almost unintelligible, image. So I actually found, I wasn't expecting that kind of really interesting, I guess, added commentary. So, loosely, the three photographs in this kind of pileup series loosely deal with, there's like American history, or American military history, anthropology, and then the natural sciences. And that's kind of the loose, collection. But I wanted to point out, one of the backdrops to one of the photographs is this really beautiful image on the right. It's brass bells that are in the collection. And I love the fact that this color checker is actually larger than the object. And so that also enters the archive as a kind of visual and, visible companion forever to the brass bells.
And overshadowed by its kind of institutional framework. I just remembered, by the way, that I should have mentioned Hito Styles' work, the artist Hito Styles, who's written in defense of the poor image as a way of, expressing this idea that control is indexed, or lack of control is indexed by pictorial resolution.
Absolutely, yeah. And Hito's a big touchstone for me as well. So, with this one, which is all about kind of the natural world, everything does relate to the Philippines in some way. And again, it's kind of like looking at an entire culture or country or people through the lens of the accumulated artifacts. Most of this stuff was collected also during the colonial expansion of the US into the Philippines. So along with, getting evidence of their new colony, was this massive accumulation of data and information in order to actually probably create sort of like the legal justifications for why, this must happen. Because for the collection of knowledge or, what have you, or to educate the Filipinos. So I'm going to move a little forward too, and sort of like a tail end to the last three pileups is a different form of a pileup. This is an image that's actually a digital composite. And so I think it's the one main digital composite I used for this show. But it's called Soft Body, and in parentheses, Fragments. And it's a digital composite of clay pottery shards in the Freer and Sackler galleries of Asian art. So, these were unidentified shards that are kind of there forlornly, in their fragmented state. And so by putting them together in this, digital form, it's this attempt to kind of narrate a coming together or an attempt to try to give them back some agency of wholeness. So, you literally see the overlapping images in there.
Actually, can you go back to that for 1 second, Stephanie? So I guess the technical term for this would be a palimpsest, like texts on top of one another, like a medieval manuscript being written over, scraped down, written over. And one thing that this has in common with those other types of palimpsest is a kind of ghostly quality, because of course, when you look at this image, which I think is so powerful, what you see is this group of objects that are normally taken almost as the very definition of archaeological data collection, because often things are dated by virtue of shards, pottery shards, because they're the most ancient thing, and also they're very stable underground. And archaeologists have all these methodologies for constructing chronologies based on their appearance in deposits. And you're creating this kind of spectral, elusive, fleeting, ephemeral image out of these multiple data points. And again, not just any data points, but almost like the foundation on which historical knowledge is built. So I guess I just wanted to salute the image as a very powerful meditation on the way that historical knowledge is constructed, and the idea that objects need to be fixed in a very particular optic in order for us to treat them that way. But when we start to think about them in a relationship to one another, this blurring or kind of, in a way, a kind of richer, more emotional, more psychological reality seems to emerge, almost like a ghost story. And ghost stories are often set in museums and archives and libraries, strikingly.
Yeah, no, that's true, right? I mean, you could look at this image as both maybe disappearing, reappearing, or maybe even shifting, like potentially moving or vibrating. And so, thinking about these poor little things just sitting there, without any kind of like attachment to a larger story, except that they were, fragments or unknown or accessories of some kind. Like, is there any way to give them back agency? Yeah. And maybe that's, I guess my impetus, right? When looking at these things, like, how can we take this given body of knowledge, this thing that we think we know or that we think encapsulates a story of a place, and try to, to shift that or to really rethink it. Also
wonderful is the fact that the ruler in the foreground, which is meant to give us the stable point of reference, has become this shifting thing in its own right. Like it's sort of impossible to use it as the device for which it was intended. And instead it becomes a kind of graphic emblem, but there's no precision there either.
Yeah. And I think too, for like the ceramic and clay heads out there, the term of like a clay body is a very common one when thinking about, the materiality of clay. So this new soft body out of the broken shards was a nod to that. And so I guess like another way too of rethinking of these images, there was blocking them. And then this other series of photogravures, which is from, the series is called After Images. These are photogravures that have been crumpled visually re-edited in such a way to sort of deny the original consumption of the sitter. These were originally, ethnological, or they were studio portraits of Filipinos that were taken in St. Louis, after they'd been imported into the display. And they were supposed to have been kind of like readily consumed tourist images. So these images actually circulated quite a lot and became ways also for the American public, well, the white American public, to kind of place a kind of hierarchy of ethnic types onto these people. So, this exhibition is more about America and the American viewpoint than it is anything actually about the Philippines. Mm. And I want to stress that, because I think that, some folks, think that if you see images of, say, like ethnic or cultural representation, there must be something authentic about it. And so this work, I hope, is kind of challenging that notion and saying it's more about the gaze upon these images and what that says, as opposed to, any kind of real cultural display.
And the crumpling is sort of John Chamberlainization of the images. It suggests the force of that gaze, I guess. That's one way you could be read. It's almost like, you're registering the impact of our looking at these objects. It's like they're giving under the weight of what they're expected to bear historically, perhaps.
Yeah. And again, too, like thinking, the very physical act for me, actually, crumpling a photogravure is a great feeling. I mean, for those that are familiar with print, photogravures are like, it's like this very classic pictorial representation of something. And I worked with Malawi Printing, who are, very nice high-end printers. And so they would spend this time making these gorgeous photographs, hand them to me, and I would just, crumple them. And it was this really interesting relationship about, having to get the image very right and then reversing, that kind of legibility. So yeah, and then moving on, there's a couple works that deal with other forms of documents. So this is a grid of 36 rephotographed documents from the archive files of a major anthropologist in the Smithsonian archives named Dean Worcester. And so these files were actually very significant for a kind of anthropological look at the Philippines, and also this very strong justification, again, for colonization. And instead of representing the documents, I went through them page by page and photographed the errors, the typed errors and notations, and put those at the direct center. So that way, it wound up kind of showing that the archive or these kinds of documents themselves could be fallible, that they do contain errors. And I also didn't want to represent a lot of the text, because, they are a kind of justification in some cases for, some pretty racist views. So how do you not pretend that that's not there, but also, critically represent them in a way so you don't keep putting those words out there? And that, I think, was an interesting, thing to do. So you can kind of, you can get a sense of what's happening on the peripheries, but it's really that, the fixed focus, in parentheses, dead center, is really what, I want us to be looking at here.
Can I ask you, Stephanie, I know this is a little bit more of a subjective association, but to me, they also suggest expurgated government documents like the Nixon Watergate transcripts, for example, although I know that's not totally what we're looking at, but it does suggest something of a crime scene or an investigative process. Is that one of the associations you had in mind?
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I have been using the word forensics. Like sometimes this feels to me a bit of a forensics, because, again, it's like if you're being presented by pretty straightforward documents and photographs, you have to look at the edges, you have to look on the reverses, you have to look for the things, the evidence of a different form of narrative, or the ability to bring that forward in some way. And so, yeah, definitely, the documents and photographs are a kind of like evidence of, this history. So for sure.
It's also just interesting to think about it as self-incriminating evidence. No.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing too are the layers of reproduction in this work, because so originally it's assumed that these were field notes that were then transcribed into typed documents and then photocopied to be put into the files, and then those are the things that I encountered. So these are photographs of photocopies of typed notes. I mean, it just goes, which I think is interesting. And along the way, there's these little, errors that come in.
It's like the image you showed a moment ago of the image of the killed partisan that had been gone through several generations of degrading, really. And it just maybe is a way of reminding us that history is a game of telephone, and we're sort of at the one end of it and can't reconstruct the original message because of all of these different layers of transmission and translation and corruption that have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. But in a weird way too, it's like maybe kind of like the Hito style idea of like the potential for the low resolution image to actually have a kind of political resistance attached to it.
Yeah.
Like maybe like the poorness of the archive in some ways actually lets us like re-narrate, right? Because there are so many holes. So again, like, yeah, how do we find agency in these images? And another way I was doing it was literally as I was sitting in the archive stacking or putting images together, to also re-narrate. And in this case, this is from the files of the Gerhard sisters, who are very famous photographers for taking these studio ethnographic portraits of Filipinos. And in this case, I used the top image is actually of one of the Gerhard sisters. And so, she's in repose, blocking or on top of the image of the woman she's photographing, because obviously it was her view, that was creating the work or the photo, not any kind of true type or true cultural image.
Can I ask you a question, Stephanie? This is maybe a hard question, but you just said something really interesting, which is that you're looking for agency in the archive. And I suppose the first thought that occurs to me there is that if there is agency in the archive, then you should be able to see it, because the definition of agency is that it makes its will or intention known. So that the whole idea of looking for agency already sets up a kind of problematic that's maybe going to be difficult to resolve. But I guess I wanted to ask you whether you thought you actually had found agency, or whether it was more of a restorative project that was about the haunting and tragic lack of agency, like you were looking and not finding, and that the work is a response to that kind of brutal, traumatic set of facts. How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question too, because like I don't see what I'm doing at all in these situations as actually changing anything, right? Like the archive is always just going to be there, like the way it is. And sure, it can keep accumulating and putting more things in to maybe remedy the record, but if these images already have so much value, like the documents and things in archives already have been narrating, for the last 100 years or however long, things have been there. And so these small interventions these are questions I have, in terms of like, well, if one is not represented well or correctly or impartially, like, of course, there's a future we can build, right? We can create the images moving forward, but there's got to be some way to still talk backwards, to still talk back, because otherwise we don't really know, what to say next, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, yeah, I would like to think that there is more apparent resistance, and of course there is. It's just not necessarily in the archives.
I think I have to write that down and put it in the label at the Smithsonian. What you just said.
Well, I guess, not just my hand comes into these things, because that, I guess, you could say that that's a visible insertion of like evidence of myself being in there. But I was also at certain points photographing my shadow overlaid on top of things in the archive. And It's very hard to tell from this image, but it's actually my shadow on top of a transparent piece of glassine, which is overlaid on top of an ethnographic photo from the Gerhardt sisters. So you can, if your screen is really good, you might be able to see this very faint face in the darkest part of where my head is intersecting, and it's a face that's looking back out at you. The photograph itself in real life, you can see it a little better, but my digital screen isn't doing so great. But so I see this as like a double portrait, and similar to me reacting to the with my hands, on to cover people. This is the shadow made by the available light of the archive, which is casting 4 or 5 kind of silhouettes of me onto an image that was produced over 120 years ago, and then seen through a kind of almost opaque surface. And again, like not necessarily the most straightforward image of an archive, but one in which I am trying to kind of position myself into it.
Yeah, I find this such an important image in the project because it's really the one point at which you, if I can put it this way, admit to your own role in the whole process as not being one of an objective truth teller at some kind of Archimedean point outside of the mess of layering and distortion and transmission, but as, in a way, just another person who's entering that procession of images. And I'm I didn't actually realize the thing about the Gerhardt sisters being physically sort of inscribed into this image, but that makes a lot of sense to me in relation to the image you just showed, where it's image on image, and you're kind of creating a metaphorical equivalency between your own, fleeting, insecure relationship to the archive and theirs, just entering at another historical point and not claiming a kind of, I don't know. I always think when we look back at people in the past, there's this tremendous tendency to claim ethical superiority over them simply because we happen to come along later. What a terrible mistake that is. And I feel like here you're really resisting that tendency, the sort of presumption of the later arriving generation. It really pushes against that idea, I think, really effectively.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to like, how do you insert yourself but not do so in a way that also centers yourself?
Yeah,
even though
exactly.
Of course it is you, like seeing these things and trying to react to it. So I guess and then another image, which is, I guess, also goes to the notion too of like light and dark and the blocking of the sun. An eclipse is literally, the blocking of the sun. And so this is a found image of a glass slide of an eclipse in the Smithsonian collection, but then I've inverted it. I've just, created an inversion of it, which is also what a negative is anyway, which is kind of funny. So, and then represented it, so it's a found image that's been, very minimally changed, but to also talk about this notion of like the back and forth between light and dark and the exposure of an image, and also some of the metaphors that we like to use too around, light and dark, that, there's this notion of like, well, seeing the light means that you're somehow more knowledgeable or intellectual, or, fiat lux, right? Like, let there be light, versus, that actually doesn't necessarily expose, everything or the right things, or it highlights certain things and not others. So kind of a light metaphor, but I needed to throw it in there. And then I guess one of the last things from the exhibition to show is these punctuations of what I call headshots or witnesses. And these are 13-inch by 13-inch portraits that are highly pixelated, and they dot the exhibition. And I wonder, oops, I don't have any more photographs of it, but they're hung at different head heights. They're hung at the heights of the assumed portrait of the person it's of. And these are again taken from a vintage image of Filipinos on display at the World's Fair, but it's rephotographed from this very, very tiny pamphlet, like a tourist pamphlet that would circulate. And the image was originally a offset litho. And then I rephotographed that and the heads were so tiny that when you blew it up, they almost seemed like these kind of very contemporary surveillance images.
Mm.
And I wanted to but I wanted to bring them into the space so that when you're looking at the exhibition, these images are looking back at you.
Mm.
You know, almost as if they're bridging that 120 years of time and space, because yes, you get to look at, you know, these images again, but how can we bring back, you know, a proposition of agency 120 years later?
Mm. I think they're very powerful and raw images too, precisely on those questions of agency we've been talking about, but also because they seem to me to allude, obviously in the year that we've had and all of us thinking rightly about the Black Lives Matter movement and elevation of consciousness around these issues, they do seem to me to allude, at least to some degree, to the criminalization of otherness in America. And as you've said, there's a specific history here of colonization that's extraterritorial. So this is not necessarily on you know, U.S. Continental North American soil, but it seems to speak to a broader issue about racial dynamics in the United States with respect to policing, surveillance, bodily control. And I wonder if you might be willing to speak about that in relation to the images.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, those tie-ins are really there because, you know, again, thinking about contemporary surveillance technologies and also how photography or image making or image capture of people, faces, or, you know, tracking and recognition and that kind of thing. I mean, it does harken back also to the history of photography as a kind of ethnographic, you know, component, right? I mean, that was about creating, you know, types, just to say there are criminal types or, you know, other ways in which people were categorized. And what I wanted to do by making these images so highly pixelated, though, was to have them be viewed as not just a historical, you know, like, oh, that's all in the past kind of thing, but, you know, I wanted it to look contemporary because we're still, the royal we're still using these imaging technologies to kind of capture or encapsulate, you know, people. So yeah, no.
It's interesting in a way what you're saying is these are surveillance photographs. They were already surveillance photographs, just not in our contemporary terminology.
Absolutely.
Stephanie, can I ask you to just flick through some of the last images that you had, because they sort of refer also to the digital research context? Because I had a question I wanted to ask you about that before we turn it open to the audience, if that's okay.
Yeah, so this pretty much wraps up the exhibition component. There's a video that is based on the photo series Block Out the Sun, and that's showing in the video viewing room. And then the rest of the images I wanted to share were sort of like the behind the scenes also of what the archive, or what it's like to sift through the archive. So I was showing Glenn these earlier today, and you know, this is literally like the online database. And so this is, you know, one of the ways that you can find images and also see how they're categorized in different ways. This is me searching for Filipino American in the archives, and there's almost nothing in there except for 29 website mentions. So come on, folks. Really, it's like, that's why I had such a hard time finding anything. And, you know, again, images of like how things are labeled, how things are found. You also can look through these. What's also really fun is there a lot of times you're looking through descriptions of things and you're kind of guessing that it might have what you're looking for. Oh, and I love this. This is, I went through a lot of American slides. This is a slide from the Better America series. And it's just all messed up. It's great. It's hard. You can't see what it's saying.
But it says poverty on the.
Yeah. That was a slide on poverty. Part of the lecture on poverty. It's beautiful. There's these metaphors that are so ripe in the archive, right?
I mean, this is why we love archives, because you find things in them that are unimprovable on their own terms. Right?
Absolutely. And so, you know, this is just literally a selection of like the thousands of images that I shot and collected, and I'm trying to figure out like how to next, you know, kind of work with. And so,
okay, so actually, can you go back one, Stephanie? So this is where I wanted to ask my somewhat too elaborate question, because I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, because we're in a very kind of with it art literate audience, are thinking about Abby Warburg right now. and the Mnemosyne Atlas, which has been so celebrated recently. And I hope I can frame this question clearly, but I was thinking in relation to the project that there's something quite postmodern about what you're doing, in the sense that you're insisting on the constructedness and contingency of things that we might in an earlier time have understood as completely reliable sources of knowledge. And it reminds me of Derrida's archive fever, Foucault's critique of authority, all these very well-known things, right? But then it occurred to me that actually we are as distant from the early stages of postmodernism, say 40, 50 years almost, as Warburg was earlier than postmodernism. You know, and he's constructing the Mnemosyne Atlas maybe half a century before people start really talking about the concept of the postmodern. We're about a half a century after people started to talk about the concept of the postmodern. So it's almost like we're in this kind of, you know, mirroring relationship to his moment. And whatever you think about that, we're also clearly on a shared arc with somebody like Warburg with respect to the treatment of the archive as not a rigorous space, but a creative space, like a paddling pool in which we make our own connections and sort of forge knowledge rather than find it. And I guess I wanted to ask you to comment about, like, pull the camera back, as it were, and comment about the whole relationship between your research process and the idea of knowledge as a secure foundation through that kind of postmodern lens, if that makes sense. Maybe thinking about Warburg as a point of reference.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, one, that's a complicated question.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
glad
right.
you asked. But you know, when we kind of talked about this lightly earlier, I brought up this idea of searches. So I spend a lot of time looking at images, not just in databases and collections, but also on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because, you know, if we can kind of read the internet as a sort of like generalized, you know, knowledge base, you know, so you type in a word, say, and this, you know, lots of things come up that may or may not have anything to do with each other, but somehow have been kind of like rotating around that search term. And so I found that in my experience in the archive, when looking for the Philippines and not finding it, I had to look at these, I had to broaden the search, and more stuff started to come in. And so like this, all this stuff is part of that search, actually. Some of it doesn't have to do with the Philippines. It's somehow wound up in there because of a search term or its adjacency or something like that. And so I wonder, you know, thinking about Warburg and how, you know, he was making these very physical kind of collages and analog things, you know, like an image search now is a different form of like relationship and adjacency, and maybe potential like parallelness, right? Like I think some of the beautiful, weird things that can happen with that accidental juxtaposition of images is great. Like I'm not sure exactly what this collection says. You know, like if we look at this image as just say like a portrait of the Philippines, like that's weird. You know, that's weird and interesting, and there's lots of red herrings in there, and there's lots of things that aren't right. But what could that maybe open up that a real, like a more thorough American archive of the Philippines might say? You know, like this grants a little bit more imagination.
Yeah, and in a funny way, there's a kind of honesty because it reflects the true randomness and multiplicity and constructedness of our relationship to a geography that we've had so much to do with and then forgotten in many ways. But
Yeah.
I really love the idea that you just put out there about Warburg having lived at a moment of kind of technological expansion in terms of visuality, because I mean, he wasn't living during the point when photography was invented, obviously, but he was living through a time that photography was exploding in quantitative terms. And one way of thinking about the Mnemosyne Atlas as a reaction to that. And we're going a century later, we're going through a similar expansion in terms of visual access, profusion, again, it's a kind of quantitative rather than qualitative shift with respect to imagery. And I feel like this work really reflects on that in a very profound way. What is it to be living at a time like this with respect to information and images about the things that really pertain to us, and how do we find ourselves in that morass, you know? And maybe that is a question he was asking in his own way.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, maybe even like, you know, in thinking about like Warburg's collages and sort of my pileups, right, where I was like layering, like the pileups for me are actually more about like the internet, like, you know, when you have too many windows open on your desktop.
Yeah.
And they're blip, 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 you know, and everything's just kind of, and then you're like, what is that? And then you find these like really weird juxtapositions, and there's something really odd about that. You know, it's quite, there's potential maybe, as opposed to how fixed things can be if you were to take them at face value.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a great point to open up to the audience. What do you think, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think so, because here's my end image, which are all the dirty gloves that when you're in the archive, they make you wear these gloves, obviously, to handle everything. And then at the end of the day, they collect everyone's gloves actually at the end of all these people's visits, and then they just have garbage fulls of dirty white gloves that then they launder and then start the process over again. So I actually asked for a bag of gloves to take away with me at the end to maybe use in something, and they were very confused about why. But anyway, yeah, I'm happy to open it up. Should I stop sharing, Anton?
Yeah, that would be perfect, Stephanie. Thank you so much. So everyone, just a recap, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. And it looks like we have two already. So our first question is from Rebecca Trewick. And Rebecca's question is, knowing that you often work with institutional archives, how difficult or not is it to get access to reproduce the materials that you find in those archives?
Yeah, that's a really good question that might not be answered fully, actually. And that's because, so, you know, the Smithsonian Research Fellowship was one in which they're basically saying, go into our archives, you know, do something. And they don't really know what that is or whatever. And then afterwards, they don't ask for any kind of like, well, what did you do? Or what are you using or whatever? And so you're like, okay, so but in a lot of cases, I don't get permission to go use things. So, you know, like the Asian Art Museum work, the De Young Museum, all that other stuff. But that's also an interesting idea, right? Of like who owns these forms of knowledge, and especially if they're about a culture in which you sort of affiliate with. Like, is there a kind of historical connection maybe that one can claim about? Well, I'm actually using this, you know. The other thing is too, I changed the context in a way that could probably be argued as, you know, a new form. But no, I actually do not usually get permission to do these things.
Well, I remember when, as we were hanging the show, you had this fantastic analogy of talking about not just the forensics that are playing your work, but that you referenced this idea of that you're harvesting in the archives. You're taking these archives that are these, you know, alleged repositories of information, but you're harvesting them in a way that you get to almost to construct your own narrative. Well, not your own narrative, but a narrative that might be outside of their original intent, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that leads to the question, are there any archives to which you haven't gained access that you are really on your wish list?
I've been approached by a couple places, and so, you know, I'm excited about possibilities. I think too, there is a difference between getting permission and then not getting permission,
Right.
And I think that's a different context, right? And I worry how it changes things sometimes when institutions say, you know, like, come in and critique us.
Right.
You know, that's great. You know, you're just like, you know, what are the terms of that kind of relationship?
Yes. So we have another question from Sharon Tannenbaum, and Sharon Tannenbaum would like to know a little bit more information about the historical precedents or the historical source material for the after images photogravures.
Yeah. So the after images were the 5 crumpled photogravures, and those are actually all shot in St. Louis. So the original photographs were taken in St. Louis. They look very, you know, culturally authentic because they were promoted as such. But you know, the shots of people were all set in a studio, and then the shots in place are actually a fake Filipino village that was constructed. to look authentic. So I really like that part too, right? That like, it's not like we were originally ever looking at the real thing anyway.
Yeah. Can I ask another question, Stephanie, that just occurred to me when Anton was speaking just now? I was just wondering if you feel a similarity between your interrogation of these archives and the critique of monuments, and indeed the pulling down of monuments, which obviously also are legacy artifacts that date to times that, you know, look exceedingly problematic, at least from many people's point of view. And there's been a whole complex spectrum, I realize, of discourse and, you know, quite, you know, emotional response to these questions. So I know it's a deep well, but it seems like it's an important question to ask, because archives seem maybe like they're quieter and just sort of sitting behind closed doors. So they're not like confronting people in the same way, but you could argue that they're very much part of the same cultural apparatus. And we should be thinking about the two things in tandem. So I wonder what you would say about that.
Yeah, well, I guess, so public monuments and archives exist in different, I guess, audience spheres, right? So
Right.
the public monument is a thing that one always has to kind of run into, whether one likes it or not. And so, you know, that message, I think, is way more public versus, yeah, archives are sort of like, they're narrated in different ways, they're shown in different ways, they're kind of contextualized, and, you know, they have these sort of like very formal ways that they're used usually. I've actually thought that, so the predicament with the archives is that they exist as a kind of cultural, intellectual capital, right? I mean, they're not going anywhere. Like an archive, you don't set fire to an archive. You know, like that's considered really bad, you know, like that's foreclosing its potential to inform future generations of what it is. And so as I'm excavating or going through these things, it always reminds me of like, well, the archive will always be there. Anything I do is not going to change it. Versus monuments, thankfully, right? Because they exist in the public sphere, there's a better sort of like process now for their removals. And so, you know, I don't want to go into the archives to destroy the photos or to remove them from sight, because one, that's just not possible. And two, it forecloses the opportunity for them to be used in a different way.
Yeah.
I just don't know how, say, monuments can be used in different ways if they're.
Well, I see we have another really great question, but I'll just say quickly, what's also maybe worth pointing out is that when monuments do get removed, in some sense, they get archived rather than being destroyed. Like that in a way that sort of confirms to what you're saying, that the archive will always be there, right, wrong, good or bad, no matter what its contents. And so we remove these things from the public sphere and we shelve them where they can be studied or whatever. So that is a really dynamic relationship between the two concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we still spend money to like restore them, even if they're in storage. And, you know, like they're because it's capital, like it's cultural and artistic capital that has to be preserved, even if the public doesn't want to see it anymore.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have time for one more question, and we actually just received a great one from Tasha Elizard. And the question is, I'll read it for the participants. When I first heard the title Native Resolution, I thought first of resolutions the US made with Native Americans to forcibly colonize land. Finding this concept is also related to the relationship between the US and the Philippines, I was wondering if you were thinking about Native sovereignty or the impact of colonialization or colonization when you're creating art around colonization in the Philippines, and do you see the force of colonization in the US and in the Philippines as connected in your work or an attempt to connect them in your art?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that Tasha, you know, made that direct linkage, because, you know, so around the same time, or actually after like the Edward Curtis photographs that were taken of Native Americans, and that was also a kind of typology, you know, that was set up, and they were also heavily trafficked and heavily viewed as like really beautiful cultural artifacts. Around that same time too were the photographs happening in the Philippines and the kind of the external colonization of the Philippines. You know, so if you think about the US both inwardly and westwardly, you know, moving, you know, to kind of like take over the country and the land, and then also moving outwards, you know, out overseas. I mean, those things went hand in hand. And so, yeah, I think the word native is also really fascinating, right? Because it can be used in multiple ways. Like it could be used in terms of thinking about indigeneity. It could also be used in terms of thinking about like foreign and native. Like sometimes, you know, there's this idea that, well, you know, are you native to a place or are you foreign? You know, and in that sense, native is seen as being very positive, you know, or in that construction. So yeah, and again, a resolution, you know, which is many things, right? So the resolution is like, well, it's over, it's done, we've resolved that, or we've agreed to something, or it's the digital amount of information. It's the resolution. Is that a high resolution? Is that low resolution? So there's a lot going on in that title. And I wanted that to be so that, you know, when people come to it, you would hopefully not just see this as a show about the Philippines, because I think that's like the initial impulse. It's like, oh, look, you know, here's a Filipino artist. She must be doing the show about her culture. And I'm actually not, you know, it's about this whole other kind of apparatus of looking at it. And so I appreciate that, Tasha, because I hope that ties in a little bit more with these larger forces of, you know, empire and colony and photography and all these other things.
So Stephanie, Glenn, do you have any last comments before we close today's event?
Oh, I just want to say, well, it's obviously been great to have the conversation, and it's maybe worth saying, because we don't often enough, because we're complaining too often about it, how incredible Zoom is at doing this for us, because not having the chance to actually travel to see the show in person, I just feel like, you know, this is one communication technology that is actually doing a lot of good at the moment. So yeah, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do this. And obviously 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible. So I think it's sometimes worth pausing and having a little moment of gratefulness. And certainly I'm grateful for the conversation we've just been able to have.
Yeah, no, and I can also echo. So I run into Glenn sometimes in the world, like, you know, sometimes through like we're happening to be in the same place, or there's a show or something like that. And I think this is the longest extended conversation I've ever had with you about just my work, which is like a real privilege, but it's also really nice to have this larger audience, you know, in which to kind of perform it under. Yeah. So I do appreciate this too. And Anton, I appreciate the gallery for setting this up.
Well, yeah, thank you to you both for your time, your insights, your brilliance. I could have listened to this all day, so really appreciate having the space for everybody to come together today.
Yeah, so thanks for coming, everybody. I recognize so many people. There's Marlene Kramer. That is the woman who supported me in my high school days as an artist, and I have her to thank for a lot of this. So hi, Marlene. Happy birthday. All right, everybody.
Thank you. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to contact us directly at the gallery. I've dropped my email to the chat. And we hope that you have the chance to see the show if you're in town. It's on view through April 10th, and it's extraordinary.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.